Welcome back to Equal Time Soccer. I'm Matt Pravratsky alongside my brother Mark, and we are joined by a fellow college soccer nerd. We have Philip Myers here of Inkblot Sports. Philip, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, for those who have not seen Philip's work, who have not seen Inkblot online, I recently discovered them because actually a coach in the NSIC, our D2 conference up in the Upper Midwest, mentioned that your site is regularly shared between D2 coaches as sort of like the go-to stress test for teams to see where they're standing as the season goes. And so we somehow had not found your work before this fall, even though, Mark's been covering the NSIC. We've been covering the NSIC for a few years. And so I guess I'm just curious because we found the work super helpful and we talk about it on our shows all the time. I'm curious, Philip, like how you first got into this work, covering D2 sports and covering it the way you do.
Yeah, I got interested in, I think football was the first sport that I got interested in at the D2 level. That was maybe 2018 or 2019. And I, um, and not too long after that, I started looking into how the selection system in football works and found out that a lot of it was pretty transparent regarding like what metrics they looked at
Right.
and how they applied those. And then I started examining basketball and figured out what the metrics they used for that were and figured out how to calculate some of them.
Yeah.
And then around 2022, I decided to see how many other sports there were that I could basically figure out how the selection system worked for.
Right.
And so around that time was when I started my website and my Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've got currently 11 different sports that I have all of. Well, some sports, there's a new metric that's been being used in some sports other than soccer that I can't calculate, but soccer
Uh-huh.
is one of the ones where I know how to calculate all of them.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like there's, I mean, not a ton of coverage that sports at the Division two level get, especially
Right.
one like soccer that doesn't get a ton of coverage at the college level in general.
Mm-hmm.
Were
Yeah.
So
you?
yeah,
I gotta ask. Were you a sports fan? Because clearly you have the skills to do the data part of it, of which like I can hopefully understand you explaining it, but I don't have the skills for it. Our public Excel sheet is as far as I really go in terms of like doing data analytics. So algebra is what I'm talking about. But so clearly,
Arithmetic is what Mark and I are capable of.
very solid in arithmetic still as a bartender. But I'm curious for you, Phil, like, are you a sports fan otherwise in terms of like the game itself, or is it kind of the data part that drew you in and doing that kind of work?
yeah, I've been a sports fan for a long time,
Mm-hmm.
and part of what I mean, Oklahoma is a state where there's a lot of Division two schools,
Mm-hmm.
and that's where I am.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of made me somewhat more interested in getting into Division two.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't until after I started like following Division two that I really started looking into the metrics.
Yeah. That's
So
I love that.
is football your favorite sport then in terms of like actual fanship or your consumption of the game?
Yeah, football, basketball, they're both up there.
Yeah. Cool. Well, and I'm curious too, you mentioned being able to do these kind of calculations. I think for a generic sports fan, maybe the most that folks are aware of is sort of having a general idea of like what RPI is. If you're like a hardcore like men's college basketball fan or you're a sports fan in general, like maybe RPI is sort of in your brain, like it's kind of a mix of like your performance, strength of schedule, like common opponent, like whatever. People might have like a very generic idea, but for like D2 women's soccer, what is that sort of selection methodology or that methodology that you're able to sort of calculate for your site? Like, what's for folks who really have never sort of dug into your stuff or maybe barely even follow our stuff, what is sort of that equation or those kind of calculations that they're making to rate these teams?
Yeah, so there's two main metrics that are used in soccer. One of them is RPI, as you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one of the quirks of RPI at this level, it does not actually factor all of the games. Division 2, the way Division 2 does RPI, well, so I guess I need to explain the concept of in-region versus out-of-region games.
Okay. Yep.
Like, for example, Minnesota State, they played a game against West Florida. That is not included in RPI because West Florida is considered out-of-region.
Right.
Now, of course, we're talking the central region here, but there are opponents that are not in the central region that would be considered in region,
right?
Depending on like geography and a few other factors.
So, like in Minnesota, for folks who have followed our NSIC coverage, there are certain teams in the NSIC that will play teams in the GLIAC over in the Great Lakes region.
Right.
Is that an example where maybe it counts as in region, even though it's not quote unquote central, but it's geographically close?
Yeah. So.
Okay.
St. Cloud State is a good example.
Mm-hmm.
They played four matches against GLIAC teams.
Yep.
Wisconsin Parkside is considered in region because Wisconsin borders Minnesota.
Uh-huh.
Northern Michigan and Michigan Tech, those are also considered in region. There's a specific in the rules about what's in region. Michigan into Minnesota is specifically considered in region, even though they don't exactly border.
Right.
But then Roosevelt is in Illinois. That's not considered in region for St. Cloud State.
Interesting.
So St. Cloud State has one game that's considered out of region.
Mm-hmm.
So what the RPI this is unique to the way Division 2 does RPI.
Right.
Division RPI is not this way.
Yep.
You just take all the games that are considered in region, and RPI, it's like 1/4 of RPI is your team's record, then 1/2 is your opponent's record, excluding games against you,
mm-hmm.
and then the final quarter is your opponent's records,
mm-hmm.
Excluding the games against whichever opponent. It's like, I never know how quite how to explain that. Yeah.
Right.
So, sounds like digesting kind of like legal language and contracts. Do you mind if I ask what your day job is? Like, I'm wondering what your expertise is, and it sounds like you're technically gifted at something else than just talking about soccer.
This is my main. I'm not doing much else besides this at present.
Okay. Cool.
That's it sounds like you know how to do it. And so you must literally be reading the NCAA like documents of governance. Like you must be going through some I mean the volume, I imagine, reading those. Is it difficult?
Well, there's not a whole lot of NCAA documents about this, but actually,
how do you unearth these details? I mean, admittedly, it's not something I spend a lot of time trying to uncover.
Right.
I also, admittedly, wouldn't really know how. I'm just curious. Do you talk?
Yeah. So a few years back, when I was first looking into the basketball selection metrics,
mm-hmm.
So there was someone else on the d2football.com message boards that was calculating the PI, and
mm-hmm.
I was looking at so the NCAA will release, before each ranking, they will release what the data looks like at that point in time.
Mm-hmm.
And I was looking at that one of those times and noticed that it seemed like RPI was being used more than PI, and so I thought it would be useful to know how to calculate it, and I looked up how RPI was calculated,
mm-hmm.
and I wasn't quite sure how everything worked, but I basically just there was a bit of trial and error until everything matched up with what the NCAA had,
mm-hmm.
and then I found that same methodology worked in all of the other sports that use RPI, which is basically everything except football.
Yep. Well, and you talked about the performance index. I think you helpfully clarified something I posted once where I use performance index as sort of a proxy for NCAA tournament like ranking, and obviously there's more to it than just the simple RPI and performance index ranking, but you did a really good job of explaining that RPI calculation for D2. How exactly is the performance index put together? Like what goes into that one?
Yeah, so that one, there's actually a place on the NCAA website. Not actually, this is ncaa.org as opposed to ncaa.com, where they have a document about how that explains the performance indicator. Each sport has a slightly different version of it. So,
Okay.
Soccer, men's and women's soccer both use the same scale, but the general way that it works is every game that your team plays is given a point value based on the record of your opponent and the location of the game and the outcome of the game. So those three factors, and then so each game is given a point value based on those three factors, and then you just average the values for all of those games.
Right. And is it fair to say, like, based on the way you're describing it, to me, what it sounds like is that the performance index is just sort of a different way to calculate at least generally the same type of thing you're trying to calculate with RPI, which is how do you sort of combine the effect of like result, opponent quality, game situation into a clean metric? Do you think of them as sort of just different versions of the same goal, or do you think they're being calculated sort of to count different things, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it's like there's just two different ways of looking at the same data, and there's going to be like in general a team that plays in a weaker conference but wins a lot of games.
Yep.
Is going to be better off in performance indicator than they would be in RPI.
Right.
Because actually that's more true in some of the other sports. Because I mentioned that every sport has a slightly different scale. In some of soccer, of course, since you've got ties, it's a little bit more has to be a little bit more complicated than like basketball.
Yep.
But
and actually, before we started recording, we were joking about the fact that the Central Region rankings or the regional rankings were likely to drop today, but hadn't dropped. They are posted now. Would it be helpful for me to pull those up like on the screen and we can talk about them, or should we?
Okay.
What do you think?
Yeah, we can do that.
Well, while you do that, Matt, I'm so curious about just the actual literal way you do this, because I don't, like I said, I'm a very simple person in terms of the data I'm manipulating. But where do you actually put these models in? Like, where do you functionally add these things up to like create the ratings you have? Like, literally on what program? Or
I've got a Python program that does it all, and then and then I've got other.
And I know what that is, and it makes sense to me. So
Okay, so Philip, we'll focus on the Central because that's easy for Mark and I to comprehend. Anything. So,
and by the way, Philip, did you go to a school in Oklahoma? Do you have a rooting interest in the Central region?
Not in particular.
Okay. Where'd you go to school?
I see that I was a bit off on some of these teams here, but let's see.
Where did you go to school, Philip?
I just went to a local junior college.
Cool. And so for folks who haven't been following throughout the fall, the very, very shorthand in terms of these rankings and in terms of performance indicator and all of those things is that Minnesota State is at the top of the NSIC. They, not surprisingly, have been the highest ranked in terms of these metrics throughout the year as well. St. Cloud State, which has up until last week was somewhere toward the top of the NSIC, second-ish. They also have been sort of in this possible field in the predictions, but this is the first week I think where we've seen this jump for both Concordia and then now Augustana, obviously in 10th in these rankings. But when you look at like this week's rankings that just dropped minutes ago, Philip, what stands out to you in these?
Well, since I, of course, released my prediction for the rankings a few days ago, I always check to see where the differences are from what I predicted, and I see I had Washburn a couple spots higher.
Mm-hmm.
I understand. That's one of those things where I could see the case for it either way.
Mm-hmm.
Washburn has, if I recall correctly, I'm not looking at their schedule right now. I'll pull it up though. Yeah, Washburn has wins over both of those top two teams, so I thought they could be a bit higher.
Right.
But they are fourth in both RPI and performance indicator, so it's understandable that they would be fourth in the overall rankings.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Concordia St. Paul is a bit higher than I had them.
Mm-hmm.
That's another case where it's like you sometimes. So we mentioned those two metrics, RPI and performance indicator, but that's not all that goes into it because
right.
You have to also look at things like head-to-head results and sometimes things like results against common opponents,
right.
results against teams that are 500 or better.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes those things will cause a team to be a little higher or lower than they would be just based on metrics.
Right.
Now, in this case, it doesn't look like anybody is particularly different from where they would just be based off the metrics. Although, I mean, it's kind of hard to process all this quickly enough. But
we're making Philip do this live. I'm gonna share. I'm also gonna give folks a look at your website only because I really like the way you put it together visually. I think this is like an incredibly easy to process and understand visual. Like I love the way you designed this. And one team that I'm really curious about, because obviously and it's also the fact that you can sort on here is amazing. Just huge compliments to you for making this like really, really usable. I'm super curious because you see RPI, which we talked about previously, and performance index. I'm really curious how a team like Mary, for instance, ended up in that first regional ranking, despite being sort of 14th in both of these, if that makes sense. So in the 10 regionally ranked teams, but all the way down at 14. And I'm assuming, like you described, it's probably like a common opponent thing, or maybe a team. Like, what jumps out to you when you look at a team like Mary here, even though we didn't see them, I don't think, in the updated standings, but even when you see them last week, right? So when you see last week, what do you think put them in that initial 10?
Yeah. So now, for one thing, I believe you're looking at the current numbers there.
Mm-hmm.
There should be a tab that shows what the numbers were at the time of the first ranking.
Okay.
The RR1 tab.
Okay. Yeah.
And if you look at there, they were a bit high. Their metrics were a bit higher at that point.
Gotcha.
They were 12th in performance indicator. Their RPI was 10 points higher.
Mm-hmm.
But when I looked into that after, I think I had Minot State in there instead.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw that they were the only team that was outside the other ranked teams. They were the only one that had an even record against teams that were 500 or better. Okay. And also they had wins over several of the other teams that would have been in contention for that spot.
Right.
And then, because I can't remember actually. Minot State they beat. I guess I thought I had seen something else, but maybe I was wrong. So this week, I guess, with that loss to Wayne State, their RPI got worse, and Northeastern State, they picked up a couple of wins against teams over 500. So so Northeastern State's number is improved enough, at least compared to Mary's. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, Northeastern State went from 10th in RPI, 13th in PI, to 7th and 11th. So yeah, it's understandable for them to move in.
Apologies, we had some technical issues. I think it was probably my fault, but we're back running. Philip, appreciate you staying on, keeping trucking. So I'm curious. Obviously, we're about to enter conference tournament time. We do still have regular season games on Thursday in the NSIC, but we're inching closer to conference tournament time where some of these teams that are on the edge, I think maybe either think they have to make a deep run and get some wins, or they might have to win the whole tournament. Traditionally, how much have we seen teams like, in the NSIC, teams like Concordia, Augustana, you mentioned Minot, Mary, they're sort of right outside of that central top 8 who make the NCAA tournament. How much have we seen sort of conference tournament runs be able to, not getting the automatic bid, but just winning a few more games? Like, do you think that's possible for any of these bubble teams up in the upper Midwest?
Well, it largely depends on who it is that you beat.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I've heard at times people just talk about making a conference tournament run as being what's necessary, but it's not like if you beat the teams that aren't like if you beat teams that aren't above you in the regional rankings,
right,
it might not help you as much.
Right. So the example in the NSIC for folks would be like if a team ends up in the 8th spot and they get to play Mankato in the first round of the NSIC tournament, Minnesota State Mankato, that kind of upset and win is worth a lot because Mankato is above that team in the regional rankings and it sort of boosts the RPI and the performance index. But if you're just making the first round, like say you're a team like St. Cloud, where maybe you're making the first round in 4th in the NSIC tournament, you beating Minot or whoever is not going to like boost your odds because they're not above you. And so you're not sort of changing your destiny.
Yeah, I mean,
with
it's
wins
not,
like that.
I simplified a little bit by saying above you because
Right.
it's beating good teams is helpful even if they're
Right.
not above you, but
right.
And you never know, it could come down to like let me pull up the regional rankings a bit.
Sure.
Like, yeah, Minot is a good enough team that it's probably somewhat helpful at least.
Right.
How much I
It'd
wonder.
be more helpful for Minot, of course, to
Right.
win a game like that.
Right.
It was fun to kind of look at the rankings live with you because one of the things I wanted to ask Philip is because like we aren't big into making predictions. Matt made a prediction that the Gophers would be good this year, and he even said they might be top 6. So hang his hat on that. But I don't make a lot. I more just try to like highlight and cover what's going on, right? But I mean, of course, if I make a prediction, I'd like it to be right. I'm guessing you have some sort of ego of like you want the model to work, right? Like how much do you care about that? I mean, because obviously you do. And then the second part is, do you ever think about how your bulletin board material for people, Philip? Because when I was told that a team really said what I said about them, it was a motivation to them. By the way, then they won. Thank God's faith. But I was flattered to like, well, at least someone reads what I do.
Yeah, I don't know about bulletin board material. I don't do much in terms of actually predicting.
You are
what
though.
A team, what a team is going to do.
Philip, when I tell you, absolutely have been used as motivation from.
Oh yeah.
There's no
For
way
sure.
you haven't.
For sure.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the times I don't really mind that unless
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just trying to predict what the committee's going to do. I'm not trying to.
Right.
Yeah.
But
sometimes I'm wrong, and I prefer to be right just because it's more useful if it's more useful to everyone if I'm more accurate.
Yeah. Maybe he's bulletin board material at the NCAA. Do you think maybe?
Yeah, maybe. I will just say we obviously are not communicating with every single D2 head coach or coaching staff in the NSIC. We don't know everything that these people are talking about. But I will tell you the only reason I ever heard about you is because the coaches were texting your stuff because they believed it to be accurate. And so I do know that at least coaches are like, let's see how we might be looking. This guy's like one of the only people actually helping predict this stuff. So it does show, I mean, all jokes aside, it does really show the respect programs are putting on you. And I think the fact that you do multiple sports is sort of what blows my mind, just because, we obviously chose to focus on Minnesota women's soccer to make sure we were most useful in the specific way we could be. And so I really respect the fact that you chose Division 2 sort of for a similar reason, which is this level of sports is not getting covered, but you and we know it's still really high quality athletics. And so that's why it's so cool you doing the work you're doing. And actually I just got a text message, Philip, from the head of the NCAA. We have been given godlike powers over the D2 selection process. You now have been appointed by Mark and I. You are in charge of how the NCAA D2 women's soccer tournament gets selected and how it's formatted. You can keep everything the same. You can change everything. There are no rules to this except that you have unlimited power. What are some changes, either small to big, you would make about how NCAA D2 women's soccer selects their national tournament field?
Well, obviously a lot of people would bring up the region system here.
Yep.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I don't feel as strongly about the region system as some other people do, especially the central region in various sports seems to be where most of that is, where most of that is focused. Like, I don't know. I don't know
is
if
people, is it people complaining because they say there's too many good teams in one region, and so then it's not bad. It should be just the best 40 teams or whatever.
Yeah.
Is it the complaint about the regions?
Yes. Like, yeah, it tends to most often be people in the central region because you got the Northern Sun and the MIAA, which in quite a few different sports, those conferences are both routinely have teams pretty high in the national rankings.
Right.
Like volleyball, I think this region has like 9 teams in the national top 25 or something like that.
Yeah. Duluth, Concordia, St. Cloud. There's been a ton, just in the NSIC. Yeah, volleyball is nuts up here.
Yeah.
So regional stuff, you sort of get it, but it's not at the top of your list. What are some bugaboos you have that you would want to change?
Or in other sports,
really
because if you follow the other ones, is there anything about like, in football or something more quirky in the sports we don't talk about that you think is even more, a problem for how it's selected?
Honestly, when it comes to the region system, I don't know if eliminating it would have that much effect in terms of who gets selected, because these metrics are so focused on, well, I think people might overestimate how much, like, if you made national selections, I think people overestimate how much the actual number of teams that would be selected from each of the current regions would change.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you would suddenly get like 16 teams from the Central,
right,
like that, or something like that. But I do think it would be nice to be able to bracket the teams in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
Like, especially, like, some of the regions are like pretty compact geographically.
Mm-hmm.
Others aren't quite so much.
Right.
And sometimes it seems like the like theoretically having the brackets like this reduces travel, but it doesn't always.
Right.
Like in women's basketball, you've had, actually men's basketball, there's been a couple times in the last few years where it seemed like Black Hills State in western South Dakota was pretty close to hosting the South Central Regional, where you've got a lot of teams in Texas.
Yep.
And one of those years, Augustana hosted the Central Regional, and it's not really saving travel to send Black Hills State to the Texas Panhandle instead of to Sioux Falls.
Yeah. Right.
But
Shout out to my favorite division in sports, currently the UPSL women's division called the Midwest West. There's no Midwest East, there's no Midwest, but they are called the Midwest West to match the men's side, which has an East. And on a day like today, watchers, where you need simple joy, I'm glad I just remembered that because it's bizarre in the UPSL. Anyway, sorry.
yeah, I mean, men's soccer. Men's soccer only has 4 regions, but they used to have 8 regions like women's soccer. But the central region only had like 8 men's soccer teams.
Right.
So for a while, it was like they would select 2 teams from the central region and then 4 or 6 from each of the others. And if you got selected from the central region, hey, you only have to win 1 game to reach the national round of 8.
Right. Instead of multiple games for everyone else, yeah.
Okay, and that's one thing that I would change is stop bracketing the teams in such a way that in some regions you don't have to win as many games to win. Like in women's soccer, you've got brackets of anywhere from 6 to 8, depending on the number of teams in the region.
Right.
And I don't know if just changing the number of teams selected makes it really fair.
Right. Right.
Like, so
there are very few, like D1 sports never have a championship in which there would be an uneven amount. Like, not that I'm aware of, but like Olympic sports, I'm saying, but yeah. So it is very funny when you say, like, you see that some teams have a bye, which isn't the craziest thing, but it is interesting.
Well, you see it, you see it in conference tournaments all the time, but the point is, by the time you're at the national, like you're saying, Philip, it's like by the time everyone is making the same national tournament, it should feel a little more uniform. So like Philip's mentioning, if you go and look at the D2 bracket, like by the time it gets posted, there's regions that have 7, so a single team gets that, bye into the next round, or 3 teams or whatever. And then in, for example, in the central region, the way it's traditionally been set up is the top 2 seeds host these 2 clusters. And so, for instance, a lot of the time, Minnesota teams or NSIC teams are going down south to Missouri and they're playing central Missouri or Western or whatever. And there have been times, I think, in the equal time era when a Minnesota team hosted the NCAAs. Honestly, I'm blending a lot of these. I think maybe Bemidji did, maybe Mankato did.
I think Minnesota State, Mankato did.
Yeah, but like you're saying, Philip, that's the unevenness of it makes it sort of funny. Is there anything else particularly in women's soccer that's felt silly or strange or something you'd change, even just about like the way the data is used? Like you mentioned the RPI formula being sort of a quarter, half, and a quarter. In D1, there's been changes to the formula, I think even this year, and sometimes people who are hardcore followers of it have sort of nitpicks about like the formula itself. Is there anything about like the data analysis and the formulaic stuff they do that feels sort of squishy to you?
I wouldn't say in particular that there's anything. I mean, I don't know much about how they do the selections at the D1 level, but I feel like the way they do it in D2 works out pretty well. Now, there's one thing about the PI formula that somewhat bugs me in soccer, and that is that it's like, in the past when they've done it in other sports, some sports have stopped using PI, so that's why I'm saying in the past, like basketball doesn't use it anymore. But in like when they did use it in basketball, it's like it was a pretty linear scale. Like you would know how much of a change in a single point value there would be between a win and a loss, and how much change there would be if somebody's winning percentage slides up from one range into another. Right. And it would be pretty consistent. But the way that the formula works in soccer, you can have somebody's a change in winning percentage suddenly like make extreme changes to the performance indicators of everyone that played them because it's less linear.
Right.
And
because
I wish I could remember.
Like
I
there's
wish I could remember the exact details, but
right.
last year I remember, I think it was in the East region,
Mm-hmm.
that somebody's winning percentage changed in the last week, and that gave a big boost to one of their opponent's performance indicators and got them into the regional when they wouldn't have been otherwise.
Right. So an example for folks who are sort of trying to think about what this would be is like an example would be if there's a team that is just below 500 on aggregate, like on the season, because how you play against teams over 500 is part of the formula. For example, this is a hypothetical. If someone wins that last game and gets over 500, then they impact the formula of all of the teams they've played in that equation. And so that's why these final games could have a weird, what you're talking about is a sort of tipping point, like data point, where it like cascades down like multiple teams, right?
Yeah, well, I'm talking more specifically about the performance indicator, because
Right.
it's like the performance indicator I mentioned, it gives a point value to each game,
Right.
and in soccer, it's like the opponent's record. There's only like they only divide the opponent's records into like under 250, between
Uh-huh.
250 and 500, between 500 and 750, and then 750 and above.
Right.
So, and if some and so your PI value can change by quite a bit if a team like slides below 500
Right.
or goes above 500. So
Right.
even I think the record against teams 500 or better, that's I think that's a little bit less prone to sudden changes affecting how you'd be ranked.
Right.
But since the performance indicator, they would be less likely to like actually look into why it changed.
Right. And so you're talking about the PI equation literally has those tiers for the teams you played of the 250, 500,
Right.
750. And so where your opponents fall in those tiers then changes that equation. And so if we talked about sort of the NCAA perspective. If you, on the flip side, were a team, or if a team reached out to you, like the head coach at Winona or Wayne or one of these teams that sort of in the middle of the pack of the NSIC and wants to know how they can sort of boost their odds next year or 2 years from now or 3 years from now, what are some other than just literally playing teams with good records and beating those teams, which is obviously how you raise your are there ways that you think teams can take advantage of the way the formulas in the system are set up? Like are there random quirks that make it shortcuttable, or is it basically as simple as you have to play teams that are good because then your opponent's strength is good and you have to win those games because then you get the points? Like obviously that's the way to do it, but are there quirks in the system that teams can take advantage of?
I don't know exactly.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, no system is perfect, but I have not looked in much detail at to what is like gameable, as people say. But
Right. Well, and I
No,
suppose
Philip's underselling. Actually, what he meant to say is he's available for consultation at all times.
He's not going to say it for free on this live show. You got to mess.
No, but I'm saying, of course he can do it, but you have to talk to Inkblot directly.
Exactly.
There was somebody in a different sport that was hoping to get some sort of consultation, but that never actually happened.
Sorry to interrupt. Were you at all so because Matt said like you have had some coaches like ask you because it's like they have to do a lot of things. You have a specific talent of like investigating this and like modeling it. It's useful to them. Were you surprised like the first time? Like, well, I don't get like once in a while a random person might ask me about players or something, a suggestion, because I follow the game. That's not really my role, but it's like, oh, that's flattering you even asked me. Was it flattering when someone just like asked you like, hey, we need help. Like you seem to know what you're doing in this. And can you like hook us up?
Well,
and who was the first coach? Name names.
When I first started on Twitter, I would regularly tag the accounts of all of the teams whenever I posted a projection. So I mean, it was kind of expected since I knew nobody else was doing what I was doing really. But yeah, it has been interesting to see how that's gone. I have had coaches message me, and yeah, I think actually like the first year I was posting my basketball projections on Twitter, is one of the coaches right after the selections were made, like messaged me asking if what I thought about how I was like, I don't think his team had a chance, but almost nobody in their conference got in after several of them had been in the rankings the previous week.
Yeah. It's well, and I should say too, I mean, hopefully just by having this show, it's implied. But the work Philip does is really valuable. He has a Patreon, we have a Patreon as well. We rely on that, to help us fund and resource our work. Equal Time became a patron of Inkblot Sports because of all this fantastic work and how much it helps us cover the NSIC and all the great women's soccer happening in the upper Midwest and across the central
I'm going to do
region.
it too personally. I'm going to add on. I'm going to add on just so you know, Philip. I'm into it.
Yeah, and for those who follow us, if you support the work we do, like Inkblot Sports is the exact type of stuff you should be supporting nationally, because our sites only exist because it wasn't happening beforehand. And so it really means a lot for you to support folks like Philip who are doing the work nationally, because it makes more local, regional, local coverage like ours possible, because we can pull from national experts like Philip. So get out there, support Inkblot Sports on Patreon. And I will say he does a nice job of sharing those predictions with the patrons a little bit early, so I always see those in our inbox, and I'll inform Mark, and it informs our coverage. And then also does what we like to do too, which is you post all this stuff publicly too, which is really huge and helps people be aware of it, help spread the word. So Philip, can't thank you enough for all of your work, but also for being willing to come on. We had never spoken. I cold emailed Philip, and honestly,
tough day to do a pod. Tough day to record your voice in the history book. We appreciate you, but nice to be distracted too, because we know people who are watching just need something to watch, man. Yeah, but Philip, what's your favorite team to watch? Do you have you're in Oklahoma? Do you like the Cowboys? Like, do you have a football? What's your favorite teams to watch?
I do like Oklahoma. Are you talking about?
Any sport,
college,
anything,
all your sports.
I like Oklahoma State.
Go Cowboys! Yeah.
And then I like supporting all the Oklahoma teams at the Division II level too.
Yeah.
Cool.
That's great.
We love it. Matt and I are kind of rural. We're from northern Minnesota, so that's part of why the D2 coverage is more fun for us. We love kind of hyping up the different random college towns all across Minnesota. But yeah. Philip, we appreciate you, man, and I really appreciate the work you do, and it makes it easy for me to give some perspective on what I talk about in Northern Sun. So we're really excited, and Matt and I are going to be doing a watch along on the first round of the Northern Sun tournament, which is one of the premier D2 conferences in the country. So we're doing that next Monday, right, Matt?
Yep, Monday, November 11th is the first round of the NSIC tournament. The top 4 teams host teams 5 through 8. And that first round traditionally has been absolute chaos town, because you have to win the remaining top seed after the first round hosts the semis and finals. So Minnesota State locked in as regular season conference champions, but they still have to win that game in the opening round to host the semis and finals. And I will just tell you, Mankato and several states in NSIC, if you look at their home road splits, there are dramatic differences, and so you want to win through. You have to win through to feel comfortable.
Good luck to whoever has to have Bemidji State as their lower seed visitor, because they had a down year, but there are some killers. So shout out to the place where Matt and I participated in math contests, but Bemidji State might come at you in the first round.
Yeah. So there's one more point that I forgot about to mention about the when you were asking about teams making runs in the conference tournament.
Yep.
One thing that since obviously in the conference tournament it doesn't really work if you have ties, so you have to have overtime and shootouts. One thing that's important to remember when it comes to selections is an overtime win counts as a win, but a shootout win counts as a tie.
Oh yeah.
So you can make a run in the conference tournament
Yep.
without getting anything that counts as a win to the
Yep.
committee.
Very good point, because at every level, we've seen it in D1 as well, that tournament play, and especially with overtime rules being changed the last few years in the regular season, very good reminder that if you have to go all the way to PKs, that one counts as a tie. Great nugget for us, because there are multiple teams, the NSIC, who are going to be right on the bubble of making it into the central region. We're talking about Augustana, we're talking about Minot, Mary, Bemidji, Concordia, all at least like somewhere in that bubble mix. And so we'll be watching them during conference tournament time. Philip of Inkblot Sports, support his work. Find his work online. Thanks so much for joining us, Philip.
And let me say before we close out, I'm here at the Blackheart Bar. This is the world's only queer soccer bar. There's a lot of hate going on in the world. I'm speaking for myself, and I think for Equal Time too, but this place is safe and inclusive, and that's what makes it amazing. I love working here. I love that it makes it possible for me to do Equal Time stuff. And so, like, this is a welcome space.
Yeah.
We'll put on any women's soccer, and the world is better when you include people and don't hate them. And that's all I need to say.
And Equal Time will remain that same kind of safe, inclusive space. We cover women's soccer because they deserve to be amplified. They deserve more attention. Happy that Inkblot is doing so nationally. Happy that we are doing it up in the upper Midwest. Philip, thanks so much for joining us, buddy.
Thanks, Philip.
Thanks for having me.